This season turn it up to 10. Sorta like a bad habit, we gon' do it again. Ready or not, we're gonna tie up some ends. Go tell a 36, try to grab all the friends. We're back like we never left. On track like a treble clef. Skip a beat on the 7th rest. Bring feast, we don't pass them over. We got the first fruits, no weight to shoulders. Can't live on that bread alone. Every word of God's mouth will fuel me on. That's scripture, that's Christ alone. That's grace alone, that's faith alone. All glory to God, cause that's his alone. Since the lamb's been slain, we can each belong. The Lord is my strength, my peace, and my song. Yet I'll lay it all down at the feet of his throne. This yoke is easy, this burden's light. Even with a loud mouth trying to eat at the mic. Even if we down south, the humidity spike. Veils torn in two, so we gon' be alright. It's all grace till the Hoff goes off. Heretics better run till the top blows off. Got them all stood still like a jaw full of Botox. Time to bring them down like a jaw on a blow pop. Don't stop, they're in need of it though. Through grace by faith, they could easily grow. New wave, new age, new way to see bro. Now one truth, life, one way to the throne. It up like the cataract. Google it, we ain't dropping any rhetoric. Or maybe so, but that's for you to find out. Don't get tossed to and fro by any loud mouth. What you think it's Indiana Jones, son? It's the year of the feast, we gon' grow some. Time to put some meat in the bones. Gotta put the milk down, son, it's time to leave home. I'm just saying there's a time in the season you gotta be a Berean. If you just hear and believe it, you could be walking with demons. It could be rendering Caesar. All the things that go to God, that's a little like treason. Wait, welcome back, my friends. Did you ever really think we could pass the 10? Our stocks up, we about to trend. Cause the whole 36 wanna rap again. Wait, sounds so good to be true. Like rabbinic candy land, ain't no ladders, just shoot. We hold true if it's loaded in the cannon. Best believe it's understanding. If it's not, it ain't proof. Like sacred name of the 2-house frame. Yeah, start to tickle, then you fill it in the blanks. You better not, you be better off. Not trying to hassle Hoff, you can take it to the bank. This night ready, he's about to go off. Put the ring on your finger from the Cracker Jack box. It's hide and seek, let's see if you can find out all the little messages you hit before the timeout. Ever seen a scholar with a blue belt? I have, he's about to make your food melt. The loud one and he strikes again, but don't let him close range, he gon' bite your friends. So relax, got it still in control. He knows every care, every bit that you hold. He knows every hair, every need for your soul. Nothing new round here, this story's been told. I bet you feel weak and your life is in tatters. With bruised feet, your body is battered. You can't reach, trying to climb up that ladder. Sit back and hold fast till Messiah matters.
These guys are better.
Wednesday, March 12th, 2025. This is Messiah Matters number 507. Been ready for this show for a whole week. My name is Caleb Haig.
Right there with you, Rob Vanhoff.
Whoop, whoop. What up, buddy? How's it going, man? Let's get on it. So tomorrow night is Purim. You pumped or what? We've had a lot of pushback.
Like last night, we finished chapter 6 in our Hebrew reading class is reading through Esther this year, and it's awesome. I mean, wow. I think we got 10. Do we have 10?
Hey, hang on just a sec. Now, this is a perfect time to interject here. We've not announced this on this show yet, but in the description of this YouTube channel right now, you can go click on it. It is a free class starting next week by Mr. Rob Vanhoff. 4 weeks long, Hebrew for Passover. You don't need any. You need no prior Hebrew knowledge. You don't need to know the alphabet.
You only need to be able to drink from a fire hose. That's the only requirement.
You need an internet connection. That's what you need. an internet connection, and it's totally free.
And a pen and a notepad.
Yeah, exactly. Come check it out. It's gonna now. What's the official title? What is it? Do we know?
It is Promise, Plagues, and the Passover.
Yeah,
Triple P.
You're gonna learn some Hebrew in there. So if you want to know some Hebrew going into the Haggadah, if that's your thing, then let's go. If you want to just learn the Hebrew the Hebrew alphabet, let's go. Let's do it. If you want to learn more about Passover, this is it for you. 4 weeks long, live classes every week. Well, class is going to be on Tuesday at what time? Who cares? It doesn't matter because it's going to be recorded, so you can watch them later.
Recorded.
If you miss them.
It's probably going to be around lunchtime Pacific. So that'll be a little later afternoon for the Eastern time, friends. But it will be recorded.
Yes.
For those on the other side of the world, it'll be midnight somewhere,
You know what it's going to be?
Accessible.
It's going to be amazing. It's going to be good. So go, hey, click the link in the description right now.
Even
Check
if you're just Hebrew curious.
Just Hebrew curious, you're good.
For the Hebrew, the Passover curious.
Yes. CHEG at TorahResource.com, CHEGG at TorahResource.com, 253-465-3205. It's 253-465-3205. Go to Messiah Matters for past shows and merch, and TorahResource.com is where you can find links to get to the, right now there's a Purim quiz up. And also, if you find this show and all of our resources to be of value to you, consider supporting us, partner with us, give a donation, TorahResource.com. Finally, last but not least, do not forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Okay, so David.
Well, also, I want to say that we have been, Caleb, Mike, and myself, since we started the annual Torah portion, have been putting up weekly deep dives into, but they're deep dives usually on a couple. We're not exhausting all the depth of the Torah portion. Don't hear me wrong. But on the Torah Resource YouTube channel, so if that isn't on your radar, go over there. I don't know if there's probably a link somewhere that you can follow. And this week, of course, Caleb and I recorded the other day about a really great Torah portion this week, which is Kitisa, of course, featuring so much theological gold. I mean, it's no pun intended, they made a golden calf. So the theological gold I'm talking about ain't no golden calf. But anyway, so go over there and check that out if you haven't. So, and if you don't even want to do that, just read the Torah, read Exodus, 30 through 34.
Okay. Okay. Several things here. David Cruz is in the chat room. We're going to talk about David's comment on our last YouTube channel and or our last YouTube video. David does not live in Tacoma, so it's a different person that I was thinking about. Okay. Ruski Bear, before we get into it, says, question, Passover begins at the end of Shabbat. How does that work with preparation for Passover? You do it. Preparation for Passover anyway. It supersedes the cooking and whatnot and all that kind of stuff. Depending on how stringent you are, it supersedes it. Also, I need to make a clarification, and I need to do this before we jump into the video from last week. I said something last week that ruffled some people's feathers, and I clarified this on the parashah that we did that will come out on Saturday. However, I want to mention it on this show for those who don't watch our parashah videos. Okay, so I said that I believe that there are some people in the Catholic Church, maybe the little old lady, maybe the little kid, whatever, they don't believe that, or they believe that Jesus has come, died for their sins, and paid the price, and has dealt with the sin problem. And that got some people a little ruffled. And I think the reason why is because some people thought it was a blanket statement that Catholics are saved. I don't even believe that about evangelicals.
Right, yeah, exactly.
So it's not a blanket statement. My point is simply this, that the Catholic Church was a vehicle that was used by God from the time of about the 4th or 5th century on up to the Reformation. Now, granted, there was the Eastern Orthodox Church But the point simply is that these two churches were really your only choice, and people were in the Catholic Church. There were certainly people who were saved in the Catholic Church then. We see people come out of the Catholic Church like Wycliffe, like Tyndale, like Luther, just name a reformer. Chances are they were in some way associated with the Catholic Church. Okay, fast forward to today. My point is simply this. Saying I am part of a church or that I go to mass on Sundays or whatever, or growing up in the Catholic Church does not necessarily mean that you're not saved. What saves you is faith in the Messiah. How does that work out? I don't know. I had somebody else in the chat room last week say, well, Catholics are pagans. They're idolaters. How could they be saved? And that's a great point. I agree with that. I think that Catholicism is a form of idolatry. However, in our Torah portion this week, Aaron builds a golden calf. Aaron builds a golden calf and gets all of Israel to worship that golden calf. And yet, God doesn't kick him out as being the high priest anymore.
The chief instigator.
Yeah, he's the chief instigator. He's also the high priest. So how does this work?
Well, I guess they came to him. But
still,
yeah.
I mean, the point simply is this, that I'm not the judge, and if I were the judge, things would probably be pretty messed up. What I can tell you is this, that God saves whom he will save, and that's
right out of our Torah portion. I will have mercy upon whom I will have mercy. I will have
exactly
compassion upon whom I will have compassion.
So, I'm not saying that I think all Catholics are saved. I'm not even saying that I think the majority of Catholics are saved. I'm simply saying that the test is not whether or not you're part of a group or not. The test, and actually, to be honest with you, this idea of go down the list of what you believe to know if you're saved is more of a reformer idea. Do you believe X? Do you believe Y? Do you believe Z? Aha, you're saved. I don't think it's quite like that. I think that there's more to it. I think it's personal relationship with God and covenant relationship with God. But I do believe that there has to be some belief or faith that the seed has dealt with the sin problem, or before Christ, that the seed would deal with the sin problem. So all of that to say, it wasn't a blanket statement. I simply believe that there are people in the Catholic Church somewhere out there, out of the millions of Catholics on earth today, I believe that there are some who have true faith in Yeshua. That's my point. Okay, let's move on. As I said, David is in the chat room, and thank you for being in the chat room, David. We're going to go to his comment. This is his comment. I've changed a name, but I will clarify that. David says this. He says, "Hey guys, love your shows. I'd like to comment on circumcision, though. I had a discussion with someone," this is the name I took out, "through email. I was in your camp saying that we should circumcise, just not as a barrier for entry. I'm still in that camp, but not in the same way I was. If I'm not mistaken, pronomians, pro-law people, which I would consider myself a part of if I were forced to put myself in a group, believe circumcision is good. But for a free Gentile, it is not mandated in the Torah, except if you want to partake in the eating of the Passover sacrifice." Let's pause right here. Now, I've made calls this week. I know people, like as I said on the show last week.
I know people.
I have friends, believe it or not.
I know people.
That's right.
No, you don't drink, and you do know.
I have friends. They believe this line of reasoning. Now, I was mistaken a little bit on their belief, but I called some people and they clarified their belief. The main point to this is not that adult Gentile males should not be circumcised necessarily. They would say there's nothing wrong with that. The question, I think, for them is more, is it commanded in the scriptures? In other words, you don't see if a Gentile comes in and wants to be a covenant member, you have to circumcise them on this day, this way, or this many days after they accept, or anything like that. To that, I would say, okay, perhaps that's a fair point. However, I also would disagree with this a little bit. I'd push back on this anyway. I asked one of my good friends who holds to this position, and we had a lovely conversation. I asked him, I said, "Do you think that Yeshua will celebrate the Passover again in the millennial kingdom or when he returns. He says, I will not eat of the Passover again until I eat it with you in the kingdom. And they said, yes. And I said, do you think that Gentiles will have to be circumcised to eat the Passover with Yeshua in that time? And they said, yes. I said, so then circumcision, so the Gentiles will be circumcised? Yes. Okay. So it's going to be kind of a mass circumcision scenario at that time. And they said, yes. Okay. I'm paraphrasing the conversation, of course, but that was the general gist of the end of our conversation on that portion. Now, I'm going to pass this over to Rob in just a second, but I will say this. I think that the command is actually, I think that it is commanded for Gentiles to be circumcised. And what I mean by that is there is no world that I can see where a Gentile becomes a covenant member and doesn't want to partake in the Passover. It is the first festival. It's the thing that kicks off the entire season. And there is some question, there was a question that I was kind of debating with one of these people on whether or not a Gentile would be able to, the claim was, well, you have to be circumcised only to eat the lamb, not to eat anything else in the meal. I would actually push on that. As soon as the lamb is on the table, it's the Passover meal. It's not just, so all of the food becomes the Passover meal if you have the Passover lamb on the table. It's not just eating the lamb. That's my personal opinion. Now, this has been argued, by the way, by scholars. And I've written extensively on this that has not been published yet. But Joachim Jeremias, however you want to say it, he talks about this. Daniel Bach talks about this. Anybody who has written a commentary on Luke has talked about this. And then, of course, anyone who discusses meals in the ancient Near East talks about whether or not the meal proper is the Passover or whether or not just the lamb is the Passover. I take the view that the lamb is considered the Passover. So when it talks about eating the Pascha, it's talking about the lamb. However, as soon as you put that lamb on the table, everything in that meal becomes the Passover. So now we could argue about that. That doesn't make or break my case. The point here simply is that there is no, and this is a point that I made to one of my friends. The Torah seems to be land specific. When you come into the land, you will do X, Y, Z. It doesn't really have too much to say about people outside of land, right? It assumes that a covenant member will be in the land. Right? That's how the Torah talks. And so the males are, once you become a covenant member and you're in the land, the males are required to come up to the temple 3 times a year. And one of those times is for Passover. The notion in my mind that a person would become a covenant member, go up to the temple for Passover and say, I'm good. No, thanks. I haven't gotten snipped yet, so I'm good. And I'm not going to, by the way. I'm going to abstain from this blessing and rite for the rest of my life because circumcision isn't a command for me. I just don't see that. I think that circumcision for Gentiles is implied. Rob?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. The question is like, where does the notion of a self exclusion? Like, I'm going to exclude myself based on something, and I wondered, because I know there were a lot of pressures. We did a Torah resource conference back in 2012. It was the first big one we did, and I did. I don't know, was it 3 hours or something on circumcision, in the Second Temple era. And it was is it Nina Livesey, I think, was her dissertation about circumcision it was a malleable symbol. And she's talking about how it had acquired all these specialized meanings to different sectarian groups and different Jewish thinkers. And so it would have very much been a confusing issue for a non-Jew to come, and if they started interviewing people representative of different groups, they're going to get different answers. And I believe the Apostle Paul cuts through that in Romans 4 and gives exactly, the meaning. But yeah, the idea of, do any of the feasts apply to me? Like if I exclude myself from that first kickoff of the whole liturgical year, how do I view my participation in it, in the whole message? Like what's the whole message? So yeah, this is but one of the questions then is back to Joshua, where Joshua circumcises all those Israelites that hadn't been circumcised. Well, and the era of a mixed multitude, right? So that all these males that participate in this Passover, there's no picture of people that we're going to watch you guys eat. We're part of the group in a way, but we're just going to stand over here and watch you all eat, right? That's just not part of it. It's a unified people. So the question there is that there was, due to extraneous circumstance, we're not told all the details, there was an obligation to circumcise that was not being fulfilled during the wilderness journey, right? There was an obligation. So the commandment was there. And for whatever reason, the Lord leaves it for us to discuss and ponder. It becomes then enacted under Joshua's authority. Okay, so the question for a person today who's a Gentile believer, they're like, one position is, it doesn't apply to me.
Right.
It's a commandment that doesn't apply to me. Why? And then they'll have a story as to why. Well, I'm not. Insert story here. It doesn't apply to me because, insert brackets. Here's my story why. And then the idea of it applies to that group over there. Insert story why. Here's why. That's one position. Another position is, it does apply to me, but I'm a little bit confused about it. Yeshua hasn't come back yet. And besides, there's no temple right now anyway. So I'm going to kind of use the precedent of Israel in the wilderness as a map for my life now to say, I'm not in the land. Yes, it's a commandment, but I'm going to wait. See, I see those as two very different orientations. Right. And another aspect then too is it apply to is it a command to anybody? Like, let's say there's a Jewish male who grows up. Both his parents are Jewish, so halakhically he'd be called Jewish, except that his parents maybe, let's say they fled Nazi Germany, they came to America, and for whatever reason they just we're not going to circumcise our sons or whatever. Right. Is he obligated? Now, let's say he's in his 20s or 30s and he comes to faith in Yeshua. If he were to do what the rabbis call teshuvah and convert back to Orthodox Judaism, they would expect him to get circumcised. Right. If he comes to faith in Messiah and he's, let's say, a pro-Torah, a messianic, but not rabbinic, would he just join that group of adult males waiting for Joshua to come, basically, for Messiah to come?
This was a question that I actually asked one of our friends, and I asked that. They said there's no command in Torah to be circumcised if it's not on the 8th day. So that would be for Jew or Gentile. In other words, the command itself, the specific. Now, I will throw a bone here to our friends, and I want to be gracious as much as possible. I tend to agree, in the sense that let's pretend that we have a friend who comes to us and says, "Hey, doesn't matter, Jew or Gentile, but I just became Torah observant. I'm not circumcised, and I want to be, and I'm wondering, should I be circumcised?" I don't have the Torah place where I can say, well, it says here 14 days after being baptized, you need to be circumcised. Or it says you can only be a covenant member for a year before you have to be circumcised because there's no command like that. So in that respect, I agree with our friends that I'm not going to be able to point to a commandment and say, this is the command right here. See, it's cut and dried. This is, these are the steps. This is what you have to do. If we're talking about that, sure. I mean, I agree. There's no command for Jew or Gentile to get circumcised that's not on the 8th day. However, once again, I think that there is an implied, back to Yeshua. As followers of Yeshua, the very first thing I'm going to want to do is sit down with my Lord and eat together. Let's have a meal. Tell me everything.
Okay, sorry, I'm going to cut you off.
No. I was just going to say, of course, we want to be able to. Why wouldn't we want to? Yeah. You know where I'm going.
There is no, the only commandment for anyone to circumcise is Abraham. Everything else is circumcise your son. An 8-day-old infant can't circumcise himself. There's no commandment for them to circumcise themselves. The commandment is not for the 8-day-old son. The commandment is for the father.
But I think that's the point.
To do a circumcision on someone else. That's the command. There is no commandment.
I agree. But I think that's our friends, like our friends who are trying to argue this. I think that there's a little bit of a misunderstanding from some who are hearing our friends who are talking about this, and they're saying, "Oh, see, adult male circumcision, that's not in the Bible, so that's not a command." And I think that it's a little bit more nuanced than that. I think it's actually our friends are saying, well, there's just no command on how to circumcise yourself. There's no command outside of 8-day circumcision,
except for the Passover. They're saying
except for the Passover, and it's not even and one of our friends said it's not even the Passover meal. It's just the Passover lamb. There's you can eat the matzah and be uncircumcised. You just can't eat the lamb. So once again, I understand the argument. But
is it another side to this is that this means why circumcision associated with Exodus 12? Why?
Yeah,
it's not a brand new thing. It means that you are part of the family of Abraham. That's what it means. It means that you are a covenant member.
Agreed, but it points to the Messiah. The Messiah and the Passover are intertwined in a way that they cannot be intertwined, which is interesting because the Jews have missed it. The non-believing Jews have missed it. So they're completely intertwined. For Abraham to be the representative that's actually going to lead people out of Egypt and show this representation of what Christ is going to do, and not have his son be part. By the way, obviously not an 8-dayer, right? Moses' kids were not 8-dayers.
Right.
So he dropped the ball on that.
In the early rabbinic midrash, there is this, why did God wait to have Abraham circumcised when he's 100 years old? It's so that future people who come to faith in the God of Israel will know, well, Abraham was older than I was when he did it, right? The idea is that it is, for someone to say it's not for me, I just want to, let's just talk, what is behind that? Who told you that it's not for you, right? That's what I'm curious about. Who told you? And I think, to be fair, there's a whole biased interpretation of Paul from 1 Corinthians or Galatians that are translated by people who are already, they already have a position, an anti-circumcision position. And I think that the translations then naturally steer an English reader into thinking Paul was telling people that the Torah was not for them. I mean, that's why we have the church the way it is. That's why they don't keep the Sabbath. That's why they don't keep the feast. That's why the food laws are done away, right? Circumcision is understood, falsely in my opinion, as part of this cluster of things that don't apply to a new covenant believer because they are labeled as works of the law. and they are labeled as things people do to try to impress God, to earn their salvation. And that's such a twisting of the reading of Paul. And so what I see, it's interesting to me that in pronomian or pro-Torah circles, there's like, oh, well, we will, sure, the Sabbath is for me. Sure, food laws are for me. But even the food laws have some interesting interpretations out there in the pronomian world. You know, but it's like, ooh, we get to this other commandment, and it becomes a special commandment that somehow everybody's like, ooh, well, we're not going to go there because that one's not for me. And so I'm kind of curious about the psychology and like the social psychology. Like, is there a group, like, because I can understand in the Messianic Jewish world where you have quote unquote rabbis who are trying to, on the one hand, identify with evangelical Christianity, but on the other hand, trying to say, you know, we have some sort of rabbinic authority and we're preserving halakhic definitions of Jewishness, and circumcision is only for Jews. And so if someone's part of a community whose gravity is on that hermeneutic, that's going to be like a strong force field to like deal with.
Right.
They're going to discourage you probably. And then in some of these Jewish worlds, they have a path of, even in a Christian Jewish world, a pathway for conversion, which is so twisted. It is like trying to live a Talmudic worldview,
right,
and sprinkle gospel here and there on it. It's real strange. Anyway,
okay, we got
just
a ton of great questions in the chat room, and we're going to answer some of these. So two of these are going to go together. Lewis says, did Paul in Corinthians celebrate Passover in the community there? And then before we answer that, because this is a really good question and one that has brought a significant amount of debate between my father and I. So Johnny's question actually was a line of reasoning that my dad picked up, but then had to kind of, because I pushed hard on it, he kind of had to abandon it. Johnny says, could Paul have been some kind of ambassador for the believing Gentiles in the diaspora, representing them in the temple in the land? Okay, let's stop. So first of all, did the Corinthian community, let's just ask this question first. Did the Corinthian community celebrate the Passover? My father and I argued about this about 4 or 5 years ago. And my dad's suggestion at the time, now he's since abandoned this, but his suggestion at the time was that there were representatives from the Corinthian community who went every year to Jerusalem. And this is where you'll hear me say often 400 nautical miles. That's because that was the debate that had me look at the exact amount of mileage over the sea from Corinth to Jerusalem and to see how far this path would be. I do not think that this is what was going on. And so my dad and I went round and round about this. And eventually he said, yeah, I think you're right. Paul expects, he says in 1 Corinthians 5, therefore celebrate the feast. In some way, Paul is saying that we're going to celebrate the feast even though we don't have the lamb, we don't have the temple here in Corinth, and we don't have the lamb. And Paul doesn't go to Jerusalem for at least 3 years. Right? So they're celebrating some version of the Passover in Corinth. Now, what does that look like? I don't know. They didn't have the Passover lamb. Did they consider the Passover meal the Passover? I don't know that either. What I can tell you is this. I think it is commanded by Paul and by the Torah to celebrate Passover, whether you're in the land or not, number one. Number two, and so I think Paul is admonishing them to do so in 5. Number 2, 1 Corinthians 11 is usually cited as the text that people are going to go to about the Passover or about the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians. I actually am pretty convinced at this point, like 95% convinced that this text actually doesn't have to do with Passover or have to do with the with what became the Eucharist or the elements or whatever you want to say. I think it actually has to do with the celebration of the symposium in Corinth. So that's my view at this point. When it comes to Johnny's question, could Paul have been some kind of ambassador for the believing Gentiles in the diaspora, representing them in the temple in the land? I think that this actually does happen. Not necessarily.
Well, he
with
says
Paul.
in Romans, he says, is it Romans 15 or 16? He says, I'm going, and elsewhere where he brings
He brings offerings
support
from
to
the
the saints in Jerusalem. And so, I think that is.
But I think this for people all around. So in other words, the father of the household, both in the Jewish households as well as the Roman and Greek households, the father represents the entire household. So I don't think that everybody in the household went up every single year to go to Passover. I think that you had representatives from a household, and sometimes I think you had representatives from a community. And I believe E.P. Sanders deals with this a little bit in his Judaism's book. But the idea that there were representatives from communities that would go up and represent the entire community to take to bring the Passover. But once again, going back to Corinthians, I think that Paul is admonishing people in that community to celebrate Passover there in Corinth without a lamb. Now, some people are going to push on this, but I don't see how else we can interpret the passage in 5 when he's talking about clean out the old leaven, all these things. And he says, therefore celebrate the feast. I don't know how we're going to deal with that.
I think that in some interpretations, they're just saying, well, he's speaking metaphorically. He's taking,
right.
Getting the leaven out is talking about inner pride and arrogance and, all the things that, Yeshua says defile a man, right? Get those things out. For in Messiah, our true nature is unleavened bread.
And that's what Durbin argued against us, right? When we were kind of debating with Durbin, even though he never really responded to any of our actual questions. That was one of the points, and he allegorized all of it, right? Oh, it's talking about spiritual things now. It's not talking about real leaven or the real Passover.
But later in 1 Corinthians, when he says he wants to get to Jerusalem for Pentecost,
right?
That's like, okay, that's not metaphorical. Jerusalem's not like, he's not talking about when I die and go to the New Jerusalem and I'm going to celebrate, tabernacling with God forever. Like he's.
So Chris,
so there is, God gives the feast for a liturgical cycle that he wants us by his wisdom to rehearse every year, right? Why does he have us rehearse and act out the same story, from slavery to being, slaves of this world to free sons of God, dwelling with their creator. Like that's the bookends of the feast cycle. And we do it again and again and again and again. And the idea that there is a permanent second-class citizen that is just like, I'm here, but I'm just kind of I'm on the margin. I'm just watching, but I'm not a participant. That there's just, we don't have a biblical exemplar of that. What we have is the scriptures about the ger is a commandment for Israel to not prejudge the stranger, to have an open door policy for the stranger, and that they represent to the stranger the whole Torah, the whole story of redemption, and core to the Passover, because Passover is not a brand new thing. He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's what he tells Moses. And I am here to fulfill my covenant promise to Abraham. That we can't understand the Exodus. We can't understand, therefore, the Passover and all the feasts apart from God's, what we call a unilateral covenant with the patriarch Abraham. And anyone who is saying, I'm going to participate in the feast cycle because it's for me, but it's not really for me, because I'm not really, whatever. I want to ask some more questions to get at the root of that, because at core, and this is core to the gospel for Paul, is Abraham justified by faith, right? That is the core. That's who we're children of. If we belong to Messiah, then it says you're a full heir. You're not a second. You're not an heir except for A, B, and C. And Paul's doing a superb job defending the clarity of the scriptures of Abraham trusted the Lord and it was reckoned him as righteousness. And that it was, he received the sign of circumcision, right? As Paul describes, and the name, he got a name change. You are a father of a multitude of nations. Why is Paul focusing on the Torah so tightly there? It's because all the groups around him have taken the symbol of circumcision, just like they've taken the symbol of Shabbat and Caleb was
I'm here.
And they've taken it and hijacked it to have special meaning for their whatever their special interest is. It's funny. You just remind me of okay, I'm a jazz fanatic, right?
Yep.
So early 50s and 60s, Miles Davis and all this stuff. Okay, so Thelonious Monk, quirky, just brilliant piano player. What's funny is he'll be playing in his group, and then he'll just leave the piano and walk around while the rest of the group's playing, and then he'll kind of come back around and start playing. So just then Caleb gets up and walks away. That was
I dropped something.
Thelonious Monk moment. That's
okay,
funny.
let's go back to the chat room real quick. Chris says this now. Chris says, if one is a vegan/vegetarian, should the Passover lamb trump their conviction on not eating meat? So first of all, we don't have the Passover lamb in our time. And I think this is actually one of the main points of the people who are saying that we don't need to Gentiles don't have to circumcise because there is no lamb to be partaken of. However, if the temple's rebuilt and in the time of the temple, there was no exemption for being. In fact, God even kind of screws in the heartstrings a little bit tighter for the people in Egypt when he says, you got to bring the lamb into your house for 7 days, right? Is it 7 days? Anyway, bring it into your house and live with it.
No, well, on the 10th, and then on the 14th, you slaughtered it.
Okay, for 4 days. But still, my point is this. The kids get attached. The kids want to, you've probably named it, right? There's all these nuances here to this animal. In other words, you're becoming attached to it. And then what happens? You slaughter it. So, I mean, the idea
Here's another point, too, is that the obligation to keep the Passover was serious enough that in the book of Numbers, after they erected the tabernacle, there were people defiled by a dead body. And they're like, okay, what do we do? We have a legal problem here. We got a conundrum. We need a resolution. We're obligated to participate in the Passover, but we are unclean. So
Right.
What does God say? Oh, forget it. You're good. No. Well, in the second month, then you're going to do what it says according to the mishpat according to the rule of the Passover. You're going to do it in the second month. So that means there must be a core to Pesach that is enabled to fulfill the obligation, even though it's not in Nisan, for one. And of course, they're not painting blood on their lintels at this point. So that is an enduring obligation. So again, though, even if we would say there is no temple, like in the time of Daniel, let's say, and we're in the same boat, and we obviously don't have an altar. So do we say the obligation is still there, right? The obligation is still there. It's just that we are prevented by historical circumstance.
Yeah.
Right. And that is a that is a reason why Daniel is crying out and weeping before God, right?
Yep.
He's saying because the reason why there is an obligation in our worship of God, and we're prevented historically, that conundrum is because of sin. That is a state of exile.
Yes.
And that is a position where we, the people who are in exile, have to reflect on the sins of our fathers, the sins of our leaders, the sins of our teachers, and our own sins, and to try to come to terms with the fact of the distance between what God commands, which is good, and our almost helplessness in some ways. That's what Daniel 9 is all about. And Daniel calls that the curse of the law. We are under the curse of Moses. That doesn't mean Moses spoke this curse over the people. He's talking about the covenantal curses that are God's just consequence for transgressing his holiness is upon us. And we are in our historical situation is understood through the law and the prophets in that grid, in that framework. And that's what Paul means by curse of the law.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting that this question comes up because there is a whole line of reasoning within scholarship when it comes to Luke 22 and the idea that Yeshua was actually fasting during this time before he went to the cross. There's this notion that he fasted the day before he went to the cross, and therefore he didn't partake in the Passover lamb. And my argument to that is that would be him breaking the Torah right before he goes to the cross. That's impossible. So
yeah, you would have to say where he says, "I've desired, go prepare it, where we may eat it. I've greatly desired to eat this Pascha with you." But then he's like going to sit himself out and say, "Yeah, I'm going to hold off until later." That would be tough to defend, I think.
And we have a question by Lewis in the chat room that
because
has come
we're
up.
Participants with him,
Right?
We're participants with him, not without him. We're not participants without him.
Lewis brings up a question that we've actually talked about numerous times on the show. We'll talk about it again right here. Lewis says, "Is communion representative of this same picture?" And I said, Lewis, I would argue that communion is a man-made invention not found in Scripture. This, of course, is like the slap in the face that no Christian, can endure when I bring these arguments up. And he says, "Does communion profane the picture of the Passover?" So this is a question that I think is very difficult. I don't know how to answer this, and maybe I won't, but I can tell you where I am in my wrestling with it. I think that the Catholic Eucharist is idolatry. That's number one. Number two, I think that you come very close to, if not full-on idolatry, when you're talking about like Episcopal churches or the Church of England or other churches like that believe in transubstantiation and or even believe that you're gaining something from God by doing this. And that would include some of the Presbyterian churches that believe that it's a means of grace. I think that this is misunderstood by a lot of people. I would also argue that I think it's wrong to believe that the communion has in some way replaced Passover. Passover is a command of God. A man-made invention that doesn't come around until 300 years after Christ is on earth is not going to supersede a command of God. And therefore, I think that people who believe that communion has somehow replaced and superseded the Passover, I think we're treading on some pretty shaky, thin ice at that point. And then the question is there a church out there that doesn't in some way believe that, right? Who's taking communion? There might be some. The church that I go to, I'm always torn every time they do communion because it's like, man, the way that they talk about it, I just do not agree with this. at the same time, I really want to, I believe that it's important for believers to eat together. They see it as a meal, even though it's a little cracker and, some juice. Does that, in Judaism, even they would say, well, if it's an olives amount, right, then it must be, then it constitutes a meal. So it's like, well, I want to show my solidarity with these people who believe in Yeshua. They're mistaken. They're just standing on previous scholarship that has been mistaken. 2,000 years of mistaken or 1,500 years of mistaken scholarship. What do we do with that? And the truth is, I don't know. I don't know what to do with it. It's very difficult for me. But I would say, so back to the question, does communion profane the picture of Passover? I would say probably most of the time, I would say it definitely muddies the water. If not, profane might be a pretty hefty word there.
Well, it's just hijacked. It seems like it's a hijacking.
Yeah.
And that's what we see with the golden calf, right? It's a hijacking. It says, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt, right? And it's like, no.
Excuse me?
Supersessionism, I guess they say it. I think it is. So it's very true that Paul says, we declare the Lord's death until he comes. We proclaim his death until he comes, right? The whole Maranatha, right? That Aramaic phrase, come Lord Jesus, we see at the end of Revelation. How long, O Lord, right? So this is the boat we're in. We're in the boat of waiting for Yeshua's return.
Yep.
And I can understand, that the picture that says, all these. So if we're going to say that, well, Passover's or circumcision's an obligation for me as a Gentile believer. However, because of the historical circumstance, I kind of see as my legal precedent those males in the wilderness that probably recognized that they weren't circumcised and wanted to be, but for whatever reason, we're waiting for it to be done right. I can understand that, but I would say circumcision wouldn't be the only commandment. That would be true of countless other commandments as well. And so, and then there's the other view. The view is that, well, it just doesn't apply to me, and that would be like, well, the food laws don't apply to me. And there's going to be people that's their camp, right? They set up camp, like
right.
They're going to eat that ham sandwich. They're going to have their pork and beans, and they're going to say, I love Jesus. And you're not going to convince me otherwise, But
if you pull on that thread, then all of a sudden there's no laws that could apply, right? And we've seen that. Okay, I think that's going to do it for us today. I know that we're only at 50 minutes, but here's the thing. Everything else that we want to talk about is going to be a much longer conversation and probably full show's worth, so we're going to end it here. Boy, we've had fun with this one, and I'm sure that we'll be talking about it more. Send your comments and your questions in about this. We're happy to talk about them. chegg at torahresource.com. That is the email address, chegg@torahresource.com. You can also leave a comment on our comment line, 253-465-3205. Don't forget about Rob's class on Hebrew for Christians, or Hebrew for Passover, rather, is what I meant to say. And you can sign up. Yeah, you can sign up for it on just by clicking the link in the description of this YouTube video. If you're not on YouTube, don't worry, it'll be in your description anyway. And of course, do not forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Okay, we hope that this conversation has done at least one thing, and that is to glorify our great God and Savior, Yeshua the Messiah. Why? You know why. Because Messiah matters.